we're just gonna go and introduce ourselves, give you a little bit of name, what we do, something like that. I'll start down here, work that way. I'm Bob Brennan. I am a retiring builder developer, having done residential development and construction for a number of years, and I'm now in the process. We're done building, still finishing that active developments, but retiring in the process.
Everybody knows me, but I'm Debbie Scott, and I lived here in Lancaster Township my whole life, and I've always been very involved with the township. I actually take care of this community center and rent it out and keep the graduate school, and I'm also on the park committee, so very involved with the township.
I'm Dick Carlson. I lived in Lancaster Township for about 14 years. I recently retired. And they called me back and asked me to work part-time, which I agreed. I'm a civil engineer. Work primarily on dams, design, construction, and modifications. Been on the planning commission for about a year and a half, and I'm also on the Route 19 Corridor Committee.
And our new members?
Sure. Meredith Welly. We moved to Lancaster Township about 5 years ago. Prior to that, we lived in Seven Fields, and I was on the planning commission there for several years, serving as the vice chair for several of those years. And by day, I am a civil environmental engineer and focus on water and wastewater. So, excited to be here.
I'm Matt Klotz. I moved to Lancaster Township about 2.5 years ago. I didn't even know it existed. I know I drove through here and I saw a sign when I was moving here. I thought it was an Harmony. So I'm relatively new that way. I've golfed a lot at Strawberry Ridge, though. I am a civil engineer by training. About 40 years of experience in the engineering and construction space. Look forward to helping keep this place a great place.
Good.
John, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm the mystery man.
Yeah.
I'm John Rushford. I'm the solicitor for Lancaster Township, and I've been here about a year and a half. I also didn't know Lancaster Township existed prior to getting involved here.
Okay. So, given that our illustrious chairman has to resign, as vice chair, I'll be running the meeting tonight, and then at our next meeting, in a couple weeks, we will be voting on a new chairman. But currently, we'll open the floor for public comment. If you have any public comment, now's the time. Go ahead.
My name is Tony Wheeler. I just want to welcome Meredith and Matt. Good to see you here. And then last meeting, we were talking about buffers and that.
About what?
Buffers.
Okay.
Yeah, did you bring any examples of that, of your projects that you've done?
Examples like pictures or something? No.
Pictures and diagrams?
No, I didn't. I actually looked it up before I came to the meeting. We implement, most of what I've implemented is buffer yard C in the Adams Township specification,
Okay.
which is what we're going over again tonight.
So you're going over Adams and Cranberry?
We're looking at a variety of them, obviously, and Adams is one of them. Adams is the one I'm most familiar with since I had to implement it.
Well, I can present this. I came across Preserve Township in Pittsburgh. Their information on buffers. I think it's laid out pretty nice. So if you look at the format of it, charts, they have a list of trees. So that's something I thought maybe we want to look at.
I can run over a big copy of it.
Yeah, it looks good.
Actually, yeah, it looks-
the formatting of it.
Formatting is nice.
It seemed to be easy to read.
Can we make copies?
I took it.
Obviously, I haven't had a chance to read it, but does it give how dense the plantings are of those materials or in the
I
text?
think it talks about lot sizes too. A 20-foot buffer if the lot is a large one,
Mhm.
and it gets smaller as the lot gets smaller. And it's mostly for industrial and, I guess, commercial, and buffers against residential.
Mhm.
So I just thought it was easy to read and go through, and has a list of trees that they plant, not creamery has the same thing, but
Yeah, Adams has a similar thing as well in terms of, here's the example.
I was looking at the format.
Yeah, I like that this is, I do like when you have something that's concise. Concise is better if it covers everything you need.
Yeah,
Word for
very
verse,
good.
it gets, yeah,
Yeah,
quite wordy.
so.
And Adams can be quite wordy too, I think it could be a bit of overkill.
I did Jackson's too, but I think that was, as the way it's laid out, I think it's pretty nice.
Okay. Any other public comment?
Are you filming us? I most certainly am. Is there a reason for that? This is just to have it on record, that's all. Sorry if I didn't ask, but yes, I am filming, and I'll be filming the supervisors meeting as well, so.
There's no other public comment. We will move to old business, since there is no new business, and we will continue on with the saldo that we have been talking about as well. So, Tom, where do we stand on any kind of edits to the saldo?
We are working on the edits in a marked format so you can see what the changes are to the current ordinance. I don't know if they'll come to you for your next meeting, but we'll get those out. John will make their comments to it as well, and then we'll issue that. So my guess is you may, depending on what happens tonight as far as how far you get through, you may do start on the PRD section of the new ordinance, the zoning ordinance, and then get caught back up with the subdivision. It's close, but it's not quite there.
Okay. Was there anything else we needed to tackle on I know we were working buffer yards was the last thing we were talking about.
We had talked about the buffer yards. We had, I'll say, cleaned up the Adams ordinance so that we could sort of read it.
And that's what you printed here.
That's what I printed, but looking at it, I think a table format would be so much easier because the diagrams don't really give it justice as to what you're trying to do.
That's what the reserve looks like, just from eyeballing.
What's that?
That's what the reserve ordinance that Sylvia's copy looked like it was a table.
And I think that's all you really need is to, in this case, they listed the number of trees in the buffer yard and the different scenarios as to the widths, how wide it is versus how many plantings you need and what percentage of those plantings. That could all be done in a table and you'd save 4 or 5 pages or 8 pages of the document. I think it's easier to read that way because it doesn't do it justice to try to show visually what that is, as long as you know that there's, for every 100 feet, you're going to have so many plantings and what consists of those plantings. So I think it's overkill to try to graphically show that, or you could just do it.
Well, what were your thoughts on the way Adams lays it out? Is you've got the multipliers. You've got 1 or 0.8, 0.6, 0.4. If you take a 20-foot buffer and there's a certain planning requirement, but if you have more, your planning requirement goes down.
Right.
What are your thoughts on?
The issues we have is in some cases where they say there's a 50-foot buffer, we don't define what that buffer is. You know, is it open space, is it trees, is it, so the question comes down is people tend to want shrubs, trees in that buffer, not so much as 50 foot as to be able to see through it. So I guess I would lean less on the percentages and saying, okay, if you make it wider, you put less trees in, because I think also buffer is intended to, we wanna hide this building, this development, whatever it may be, I think you want the number of shrubs in that area, not so much as how it's laid out.
The thing about that, it makes sense to me, when we're defining a certain number of plantings and it'll work. The smaller it is, the more dense it's gonna get, the more larger it gets, the more spread out it's gonna get. But they're not saying anything, oh, I'm gonna take a larger size without to put in as many plants, you're still putting in the same number. It's just,
Correct. And then you get into, if you have 18 shrubs and you've got undercover trees, the question is, if you're putting too much in an area that, you know, granted it's 100-foot length, is it too much stuff in that area that I think it'd be better off saying, hey, we want major trees planted, sort of like the 319 committee did, we want these size of trees planted every so many feet, we want shrubs planted so many feet. I think it'd be better off doing something like that. And you'll see that at your next meeting when they do their presentation, but that may be something more mimic to try to hide what's going on as opposed to saying, okay, we'll make this wider and less shrubs. But I don't think that, I think it defeats the purpose of what the intent was.
One of the things we've struggled with on the implementation side is when you've got existing vegetation along the property line, and we leave it, we don't clear it during our development work, we can count those trees. Now, oftentimes, I'll be up against, and we'll go and clear the other stuff, and we'll be up against some really mature stuff. Could get to 100 foot tall. And now we're being asked to go and fill in underneath of that with some understory trees and shrubs, which clearly can't survive.
Right.
Because the other trees are already there, just totally overwhelming the thing. So it's a struggle to actually implement when you do that. And the last thing you want to do is cut down that existing stuff, leave it there. But how do you go and actually implement when you've got that existing stuff? Now, if you're planting all fresh, clearly canopy and the understory trees and all can coexist. But eventually, the only thing that's going to survive are the canopy.
That's what I mean, I think you have to look at, you know, this is a requirement in the ordinance, but existing vegetation, you don't need to replant that buffer subject to the planning commission, so you can actually look and see what's there. You know, and see, okay, this is dense, this isn't gonna be touched, so therefore we'll allow you to keep this buffer and maintain that buffer. And I think you want to encourage that, you know, maybe in those cases, maybe the buffer shrinks a little bit because you're keeping the vegetation, you're not doing a clear cut of development. So you give them the incentive, okay, if you do this, we'll take that 50-foot buffer to a 25-foot buffer, as long as you keep that dense wooded area as your buffer. And I think there's an incentive to do that, because then it's mature trees, it's not new plantings that may or may not survive a couple of years, or if you have a drought condition 3 years later, stuff like that, so.
somewhere in there, we should put the goal of this is to create the buffer rank. So it's not about how many trees we plant, essentially, we're putting in standards, but the goal is to create the buffer. They can do that with less, that's, you know.
That's a tough thing, because how do you evaluate it? It all comes down to how do I as developer, you as engineer walking that site, determine whether it passes or fails. A tree count you can do. Something like, is it dense enough? We may never agree.
Correct, because I mean, you look at it in February, and it's gonna look different than it is in June.
You're still gonna have the tree count, but the way the trees are arranged, the way they put in, if you have these large canopy trees, like you're saying, with the understory trees, you know, the goal is to create the buffer. It isn't to put trees in there that are gonna die because of the sun, which may be doing what these are not. So we still require the trees, but the state, the goal is primarily creating the buffer. Not trees that have to meet something on the checklist. That's all.
I mean, ultimately, you don't want to see whatever it is, but again, it could be one development next to another development, you see that development, so you want to buffer it and shield it, and I think that's really ultimately what we want to do. So that's what I just didn't like the percentages and the reduction and the
we might already be developed there, but to change the rules like that, I think might be a little. more difficult. And Bob, you're probably gonna shut down the block, I'm sure you're talking.
What was that?
You're probably gonna shut down the block, I'm sure you're
No.
talking.
This does have a provision regarding maintenance in the buffer area. Maybe a violation of the ordinance, what we talked about last time.
Yeah, I do like that part, because
It's
it
under
is
four
something.
thirty, seven,
Which one is it, John?
430, section 430-76.
Hey, Bob.
What is it?
So 43077 kind of takes into what you were saying there.
Where you at?
43077, item C, or B, I'm sorry, it's B. The design of the planted buffer shall consider the use of the portion of the property being screened, blah, 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 but also incorporate existing wood, wall, fence, earth berms. I don't know. I think that's summarized it. But how do you, again, quantify that? Standing 10 feet from the plan, can you see it? Or-
Well, it says on C, notwithstanding above the minimum less than 10 feet for the horizontal and buffer requires long periphery of an area designed, planted, graded, and otherwise developed.
Well, it does say to
For the
obscure.
activities of this site from the-
It does say obscure. So now define obscure, but yeah, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
that's what you're saying, right, Bob? I mean,
Well, what I'm not seeing in here is they do define, much like Adams does, the type of buffer, A, B, C, and D. And they give each of those a width, which I think is a good thing to have. But what I don't see is, okay, what do you require to put in A, B, C, and D in terms of materials? You determine it.
it does say, that says plant materials usually should consist of appropriate mix of deciduous and evergreen trees, shrubs, ground cover.
Okay, yeah.
And it says to render instant effect. That's kind of tough.
That, where was it?
It's an FB, it's still an FB.
Required.
The same one I said that I think covers what you're
It's
saying.
not really defined.
Yeah, that's a horrible definition.
I agree. I don't disagree.
You can't just say yes or no. I wanna have something that we write that we as a township and the developer can go and meet and say, yes, it meets, no, it doesn't meet. Black and white. Keep it simple.
And enforcement on the township's part has to be black and white, so you have to have something
So
defined.
just saying something that an appropriate mix doesn't cut it.
Well, I think if you define render instant effect, that would resolve it.
Yes, and
It does say that though. It does say render instant
Yes,
effect.
but that's the problem. No one's going to agree on what that means.
Right.
Because if what that really means is the day it's planted, it's a whole buffer, it's never gonna work, because you can't plant shrubs big enough.
I don't disagree.
Yeah, I think you need to define similar to the Adams.
I think that
You
you're right.
want so many trees, so many shrubs, so many variation of four plants, I think you need that as part of this.
I agree. I think A, B, C, and D, if you use the A, B, C, D, each would have the Adams count, tree count. And I do like Adams' definition of canopy, understory, and shrubs. And you have those three categories, you put a count on each of those per buffer type, and you use that as your definition. I would agree. You throw away all these pictures.
And you can, it's not gonna work. and-
They're tough to,
No, it's.
the word doc, you can actually see them. And you can eat them, otherwise.
Well, even in Adam's definition, like under shrubs, it says 24-inch height, and spread minimum 36-inch height for screen planting, so it gives you much better definition, I think, than the other one does.
But it does say the tree caliper of 8 inches or more measured 3 feet or more above the ground. I mean, it's pretty specific.
Not like Adam's is.
Oh, okay, I don't have that, so I can't say that.
Which Adams are you referring to?
There's landscaping and buffer yards.
The chapter 192?
Yep.
Okay.
Does the it sets up their types by visual screening. Is Adams the same way? They want complete visual screens?
Well,
Reserve seems very, very, closed, from a developer. You gotta block this whole view of my development.
correct.
See,
And I
That's
think,
exactly what we want in this township.
what,
Yes.
well, I do not believe that's what we want. I believe different zones that touch different zones have different requirements in terms of how screened they are. And that's why, in Adams and in Reserve, they have different widths. And I think the wider it is, the denser the plantings become. And it's a very narrow width. It's not as opaque as it is as you get wider. It's our job to figure out where we want those break points to be and how we want to find it. But I do not in any way believe that all zones or all buffer types are an opaque screen to the neighboring buffer. If you've got residential to residential, you're not gonna want as much break as you want residential to industrial.
You want, if you're residential to residential development, you want as much blockage, you do not want to see that development. You want that, you still want to keep that screen there where you cannot see that.
I respectfully disagree.
As a property owner like that, I agree. That's what I'm
I hear you, I hear
And
you,
you're not a property owner that has not been damaged by that. I will tell you that right now.
I hear you, but right now we're discussing amongst the board. It is not time for public comment. We will continue board discussion.
it seems like, it goes back to the reserve, that the visual screen is not dictated by plantings. It says total visual screen. It's defined. And in the Adams one, it's more defined by the planting types and to create the landscape buffer. It's not so much, because this is total obsolete, total visual screening is C and then total visual, and then D has odor, lighting, has a whole nother layer of buffer. So it's very, very, conservative, which is up for discussion.
No, I'm not gonna argue we want this.
No, I'm just trying to get an understanding of the Adams, because it seems like that was where your experience was from.
My experience is with Adams, and it is definitely not a total screen. It's basically a level of planting material that will mature to something that appropriately blocks different zoning types. I like the form of this.
Yeah.
This is much more concise
Right.
than the lengthy Adams stuff. But I think the theory behind the Adams stuff put into a form more like this could be very appropriate.
I mean, you may get to the same end game when you put all these plants in there and the canopy trees. I'm sure the buffer is pretty complete or big.
Well, over time it will be, not immediately. Yeah, things have to grow.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand that Adams is more of a planting species per width of buffer that you need.
What do you guys think in terms of, right now, which direction are we going to write something basically? And I'm leaning towards we write something that looks more like this word, using more of the Adams content to do it. That's what I'm thinking. You guys have thoughts?
We good with that. I like them specifying the number of trees, shrubs, canopy, whatever, per subdivision area, because then we can define it, we can enforce it.
Yes.
Again, as I stated, there's a goal. I think they just pointed out the goal in this Reserve Township was total screening, right? I mean, that can be, I don't think there's any disagreement there. I think it's not. You can see on the other side, yeah,
Well, the problem with that is, they're not making the determination, and the time of year they're making the determination. There's all kinds of, it's a very difficult thing to actually evaluate.
Right. Again, there has to be some negotiation and some understanding. They just plan, they're not gonna have a total screen. 5 years later, you will. That's the goal. I'm okay with merging these. It's a little more work. Do we go through the
reserve and just change what we want based on,
Yeah, we'll get to there in a minute. Anything else?
I did like the way this one played out.
Reserve one,
I like the specific, the specifics, and it's easy, it's easier to read.
it's more concise.
Yes,
It
yeah.
is. What are your thoughts? Oh, okay.
So I think, I like the content of the items. I think the format of this is preferable to use. I think the thing that we need to be careful about though, if we are going more with, you know, how we're defining the density of the screening based on different, you know, uses that we're trying to buffer against, is the maintenance. So I feel like the language in the items is a little weak on the maintenance side of things.
That's what we talked about.
Oh, we already talked about, okay.
And that's where I think this reserve has that paragraph.
But I still think I think it could be stronger.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
could be.
because over time, you know, after, 5 years, looking at this most of it, nobody needs it,
Right.
it's not watered properly. Who's the responsible party for making sure that all these buffers are put in?
I don't disagree with that. Adams, essentially, the way Adams works is that the developer is responsible for the 18 months. And you walk at the end of the 18 months,
Yeah.
you replant anything that's dead, and you walk away, and then they never enforce it with the property owner. That's really the way it works, and it's not a great solution.
now is that something the homeowners association would take over?
Depends on your declaration in your community. Typical declaration, unless it is common elements, the homeowners association is most likely not going to be responsible. That would be the responsibility of the actual property owner that owns that buffer. Most of the way we develop, that property line goes to the back property line with a 30-foot or 20-foot buffer yard defined on it, which would then be the responsibility of the property owner. Now, you could have required developers to go and assume that responsibility and put in declaration,
Right.
but you're gonna get pushback on that from the developer too, as to, you know, now you're asking them to do more, hand over more for the HOA to go into, which, so,
And then it becomes an HOA issue.
it becomes an HOA issue if you put in a declaration making the HOA responsible.
And if they don't wanna do it, they can put in more permanent means. Like a berm.
But at least you go back and forth at the development stage of the planning commission.
Honestly, personally, I hate seeing much fences. I think that just closes off.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of fences. I like natural vegetative buffers that aren't opaque, actually.
Didn't the parks, the Route 19, looking at fences, it's kind of a signature, like a white fence?
The Route 19 corridor, yeah, but those were the horse fences, just the split rail.
Just the separation zone.
Right.
And then the plantings behind it or in front of it, and,
That seems, you know, fast or some sort.
You're not gonna get the screen from that, that was just to kind of create a line. Is there any inspection, I mean, do they do annual inspections, the township do annual inspections, the buffer zones? So without an annual inspection or biannual inspection, there's never gonna be any enforcement unless somebody complains.
Right.
right.
That's
So
the
they
most
would yell
of
at
course.
Yeah.
Who plays horticulturist, who plays the tree person, the shrub person, who decides if the plantings are good, is that the engineer?
The township would have to decide how they wanna do
Correct, and
this.
then ultimately the supervisor will decide on the plannings, and we would rely on professionals to get information from the city's planning board in this area.
Reserve indicates the zoning officer will do inspection.
Yes,
But, yeah,
and you need to hire somebody for that.
Yes, we better
I keep saying,
that's a very special area, right?
Yeah.
yeah, it's just a matter of, you know, there's time involved.
Yeah,
And I can tell you, right now, I'm putting in more hours Now, maybe once the developer does their last 18 months, maybe 6 months after that, and then annually after that, just to see if everything's still going, you know, that kind of thing.
Instead of the township taking that on, can we push that on to the homeowners association or the owner of the property, where they have to have somebody come and do an inspection and compare it to what was planted, and then they have to submit that.
You're gonna pay someone to come.
Because you know what they're not gonna do?
They're not gonna.
You can tell them they have to, but then if they don't do it, the zoning officer still going in anyway. So I think it's just,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to avoid the township having to take on that responsibility, although we're putting it on ourselves by requiring it, but it's mainly to protect the surrounding homeowners, it's,
correct?
right.
I
Not
don't
just
think it's
surrounding owners, it's protected development that just been built too, depending on what zone touches what zone.
Yeah. I mean, I can't see if the township requires it, that they're not going to do the inspections, you know, I'm not a legal person. But then you also have
It
an
makes
enforcement
a fine.
issue, it's gonna cost money.
The fine has to be higher than the whole cost to pay the guy to go do it. So it's
I mean, yeah, one way or the other, the township's gonna pay to have it done, and, you know, keep that in mind as well, because there is a cost involved in that. So then say somebody doesn't do it, and I usually give everybody a call in, or give a friendly warning, and then they don't do it, then I go and give them, you know, everything, you know, give them a certified letter, give them all that. If they still don't do it, they have to take it to court, so I have attorney's fees involved.
Right.
So you just want to keep that in mind, that anything that we have here, which I think we have to have enforcement here, I'm not saying we don't, I'm just saying keep that in mind, that it is a township cost, and it will continue to be, anytime there's enforcement, there's costs involved.
Just tell them we don't snowplow the roads if we don't comply with the buffering inspections.
That would be nice, you know, when you do that, then come on, you know, just look at the law for that house, put it back down for the next one, that would be hilarious. Legally.
I think legally they would have to.
It's that person slides out of their driveway.
Thinking out of the box, you know?
But I get you, yeah. That would be kind of fun.
In development, Adams, do you have any issues post installation of these buffers?
Oh, yeah.
It's gonna be a nightmare at times.
We actually count on replacing half the trees in 18 months. That we budget that into our stuff right out of the gate. That we know we'll meet it right, because I only plant them right before I offer the road for dedication. I do the planting, because I know they're gonna be dead if I don't. Then we do our engineer walk approval, the township takes it, accepts the roads. 18 months later, I go to release my maintenance bond. Engineer and I walk the project again. He says, replace this, 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 and this. I get landscaper to go replace them. He says, yep, you're good. I'm out of there. You know, that may sound cold, but there's no other better way. There's got to be definitive lines and definitive ways of saying you've met it or you haven't met it. I agree. Enforcement is a huge issue. Just because we say it's got to be maintained, which we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't.
Right.
It's how do we enforce that, and then what level are we going to go to enforce it? Because you could go to the whole level of demanding that the township then has the right to go in and plant the stuff, and replant and build the people or lien the property. You can go that whole extreme if you want. So,
Problem with that.
Where do you
is
go?
the township's going on private property.
well, that can be all part of, it could be written in as part of the buffer yard. They have access to that buffer yard. So when you're going to development, you can certainly go and
Oh,
give
yeah.
them pedestrian access or township access to maintain buffer yard. That can certainly be done on a recorded plan with no problem. At what level?
Yeah, how far do you want to go?
Yeah.
How far do you want to go?
I think it should, that natural landscape buffer should be given a lot of precedence too. You know, like there's a stand of trees that are beautiful, you can't see through that. That should be the buffer, and someone should maintain that between those two. I mean, there should be some preference to the natural environments because of your maintenance. Those things have been there for a long time, and you said 18 months, what happens month 36, 54, 72? You got a whole Cyclone, who's replacing the trees then?
And it's a problem, let me tell you, right now, I have a dead tree in the middle of my yard, that tree's been there since I moved in 36 years ago. This year, no reason, it's just done. So if that's part of the buffer, tree fund, it's been that long. So what you'd have to do, I think, is you would have to, if you're going to have somebody in the township inspect, which I think is the only way we can do it, then that person would have to go annually and take pictures every year. Because otherwise,
Which is a huge burden on the township.
it's a huge burden on the
The
township.
other option is enforced by complaint.
Yeah.
That when there's a complaint, then the zoning officer goes and looks. And you only enforce when there's a complaint. That's actually the way a lot of enforcement in the township is done.
Oh, yeah.
That's correct.
And rightly so, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just,
We're not the right even to go into people's properties, so, you know, if somebody's got, 20 acres and they have 50 cars sitting back there in the back lot, I have no right to go into that property. So, if they're back there and I can't see them, unless somebody complains, that's not anything I can do.
go ahead, Mike, but we are gonna limit the amount of.
The question is, anybody on the board know anybody on Reserve Township Board of Supervisors or zoning officers? Is anybody here that, I'd be curious to see how they enforce this. I mean, I'm sure that this is new, this.
Yeah. I agree too, I mean, should
I'm trying to answer some of the questions.
see what works, what doesn't.
Where is Reserve Township, by the way?
Troy Hill.
Valuing.
Troy Hill,
Yeah.
Pittsburgh.
I'm just saying, they've been enforcing this, maybe they need some tips.
Or, yeah,
Huh?
well, bad idea.
Okay, fair enough. But that might be their tip, they'll be like, don't do this. I don't know. I'm just thinking if they have this in place, they might be able to answer the question.
I can call a couple of different townships, not every zone, see what they do.
I think it's worth.
Reach out to the solicitor there and see.
Okay.
I can reach out to the solicitor reserve.
I think that's a good idea.
It's worth asking the question, and it's definitely worth having maintenance and enforcement in here.
But you have to have it.
But just at what level are you really gonna do it?
There's a lot of regulations related to fencing and the reserve.
Yeah.
Fences and walls, it gets into like, these are different issues, like property boundary or the big.
Okay, so let me summarize. Where we're at this point is you, Tom, could take and merge the densities of atoms into a reserve-like document. That would be good on the plant list. And the plant list, I think, is a starting point. We can start with Adam's plant list because they're really close to us, and then we'll have some. We'll run that by someone at Lake Forest or some other horticulturalist for the list of materials and say, oh no, skip that one or add this one. We'll tune it from there. We'll start with that as a starting point. Sound good? So, I do think it's worth going through reserve a bit, point by point, saying if we like it or we want to strengthen it or whatever. But getting back to your question on fences, I think fences, there's a couple things we have to talk about. One, Adams actually builds fences into their buffering. If they've got options of these things where you can take this plant and cut this plant back, right, have a fence in front, and it gets really convoluted and stuff. There's that level of fencing there as part of the buffer, and there's also just fencing. So, where do we want to go with fencing?
And you have to be careful, at least in some areas, if there's any kind of easement, you can't do fencing, so.
What do you mean?
According to our current ordinance, if you can't do fencing over any of these stormwater easement, what easements are there, sewage easements. Yeah, any kind of easement, you cannot do fencing. Unless you put gates in, right, yeah. So that's just a side note when you're talking about fencing, so.
So, wait a minute. You're saying if we did a fence and related to a buffer yard around the development,
You just have to watch for easements, that's all I'm saying. And
typically in those cases, an easement's gonna end up probably running parallel to that fence to begin with.
Right.
Usually.
one side or the other usually.
That's what
Yes.
we want.
That's exactly what we want.
That's the.
But if it's over the easement, then you have to put gates in.
And the rationale behind it is to be able to get to that stormwater main. Okay. Not that you're thinking that the fence is blocking the easement, it's that you need access if there's a fence.
Yeah, if there's an issue, then, yeah, have to be able to get in there, so, rather than running somebody's fence down and, you know, building this and make sure the gates in, it doesn't make them happy. Well, actually, right now the ordinance reads you cannot build any kind of fence over an easement. Period. That's how the ordinance reads.
Wow. So if someone wanted to put a dog fence in their backyard, they couldn't do it if there's a swale that's an actual stormwater easement.
Correct.
Wow.
Yep.
That's restrictive. That's overly restrictive.
Yeah.
Well, they made an exception, Michael,
Gate, you know,
they put a gate
Mm-hmm.
in our,
in our,
gates.
Michael would allow that.
Well, I think that's something we should definitely talk about, because I see that all the time. You have a stormwater easement behind the houses in a swale, and people want to have a dog fence the whole way around the property, or a lot of it, and it goes right across that easement. Rightly so.
Just put a gate.
Yeah, but you're saying it doesn't even allow it now.
Doesn't allow anything right now. But Hardwood, there is an agreement with Hardwood that Michael Ford entered into, that allows, that you have to put a tablet gate on the side.
And it has to come down if they have to do any maintenance, and it's, even if it's a permanent structure, you have to take it down, the property owner has to take it down.
Well, that would make sense.
Yeah, I had to build a deck, I had to change my dimensions to stay out of the easement.
Yeah. Just something we run into, I just wanted to point that out, we try about fences, so. Anyway,
So, let's tackle the fence with respect to buffer yards. Do you like Adam's provision of allowing fences in buffer yards and that changing the description of that buffer yard?
I think in certain circumstances, a fence may be even preferable to a buffer zone, or along with it. The fence, if it's solid, it's gonna knock down noise, it's gonna definitely give you that's the permanent screen, you're not gonna worry about, a lot of, the trees usually leaves in the winter. So in some cases, it makes sense, and I don't know how to define what that's gonna be, but I wouldn't rule it out or eliminate it.
Any other thoughts? I don't have a strong preference.
I think it's uses, if done engineered properly.
Obviously, they put a lot of exclusions on it, like no chain on. This is how it's going.
So do we want to, as Adams does, say like,
I'm not a big fan of berm walls, so,
we'll get that in a minute.
that's a wall, I mean, it's a fence.
So like buffer yard E in Adams, E or F, for good examples. They both have, and we'll skip the barn part of those, but the fence, they have a fence, wow. Even the word duck, I had so tough time.
Yeah.
Looking at glasses, F3, F4, and F5 it looks like.
Correct.
They have 3 different fence options depending on the width of that. Now, we've already decided we're gonna scrap like the 0.8 and 0.6 kind of stuff, right? So we're gonna leave it at, there's a width for the buffer. And then if you wanted to put a fence,
you want to limit the fence heights.
what's that?
Limited fence types.
Yeah, there's different fence types, and so, what did you say, Sylvia?
Did you want to limit the fence types, or do you want to allow any of the fence types?
Well, that's the question, because they've got, it gets very complicated as to what fence mix and what width. And using a fence and buffer and plants, because otherwise the developer's probably not gonna put a fence in. It's gonna be cheaper to throw some extra plants in than it is to throw a fence in. So there's gotta be some incentive if you really want fences.
Noise.
I mean,
To me, that's the big one.
that's our incentive. It's not a developer's incentive. Developers' incentive always boils down to money.
To me, that's when you want to require a fence, is if you put in something that's gonna generate a lot of noise, a lot of lane hour, traffic, something like that.
Like a commercial development.
So what we have seen is, it was a residential development, next to it was a farm that had horses. And so they wanted a fence put in to keep people away from the horses. So that they allowed the property to be 25 foot instead of 50 foot, as long as the fence was put in to maintain the property.
Who won?
The farm owner, the existing property owner on the adjacent property requested that the buffer be reduced and a fence put up.
Was that here or somewhere else?
Somewhere else.
Okay, and that was negotiated.
That was negotiated with the developer as part of their ordinance preparation, so that they had better protection, so they don't want somebody's backyard going right up to the line fence for the horses. They want it 25 feet away. Then they had their own fence, so they had that area of millions, I think, but that's what they prefer.
Double fencing.
And they were thrilled with that. And the developer didn't care. And in this case, it worked out because of the layout that they were able to do what they wanted to do with the 25-foot buffer.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a win-win in that scenario.
You gave them a little bit more area that they could develop.
Correct, because of the terrain and whatnot, trying to erode in, lots coming back.
See you, Jenny. Good luck.
So just because a property owner has a fence doesn't mean that the developer doesn't have to put a fence in.
Well, no, I mean, that
Can't
was,
use that.
it was a 50-foot buffer in the ordinance. And the question was, what do you put in there? That was their solution.
Mm-hmm.
So,
But it was a negotiated solution, it wasn't an ordinance solution.
well, they actually wrote it into an ordinance. So, it was part of they had a group of individuals, adjacent property owners, with the developer create the ordinance. So, it actually worked out well.
With such expansive property in this township, do you need a bigger buffer too? Like I can see like a highly developed area like Adams or Cranberry, has that density, so you can't have 300-foot buffers. But is there any thought to have, for certain types of zone areas, have a greater
I
buffer?
hope it's not me.
Not mine, I don't know. Try to make the buffer for commercial.
So, I do think the buffer width should vary between different use types. What those numbers are, you have to decide, but yes, it should. Certain classes of things should have different. One of the things I struggle with, a couple of things I struggle with. If you're doing a just planting, obviously that buffer yard has to be totally on your property, not an adjacent property, so you can't use his buffer as your buffer. So, say you're required to put in a 20-foot buffer, or whatever, on your side. Then later, property next door is developed and he needs to put a 20-foot buffer in. So now you actually have a 40-foot buffer, which is nice, no problem. Say you throw a fence into that mix, and that fence has to be off the property line, it can't be on the property line, it has to be on your side of the property line. So now you're gonna have a fence and plantings. Then the neighbor comes in and puts in potentially a fence and plantings, and you've got 10 feet in between these two fences, which is basically never gonna be maintained, because there's not gonna be any way to get there. So, I struggle with how to implement this correctly, because it is, you're right, depending on the use type, if you're going up against the commercial, the residential against industrial or something, it'd be nice to put some kind of solid fence in to block things. But then you're gonna require the guy on the other side too, when he develops it, and now you've got it twice.
Well, you can always allow the option of developer putting a fence in, but it's not a mandated, element of the regulation.
Yeah, they're always allowed, it's just a matter of.
Well, if they're allowed, if we put it in, they're allowed. And then,
In the buffer, yeah.
yeah. And then you think, Tom, if we did some kind of incentive of reducing that buffer,
Because I think ultimately that style of fence is providing a buffer. You're not gonna see through it, you're not gonna have noise, so it's serving its purpose, and there's a cost for that ultimately on the property owner to maintain that fence down the road, but, I mean, I think it's what you want, it's not waiting for planning to grow, it's not, what happens if the tree falls, it's gonna be, fence gets in disrepair, you gotta fix it, but other than that, it's going in. So I would say that there should be some incentive to reduce it where fences are implemented.
Yeah, I read the Adams one too, they allow mixed use in the buffer zone, they allow pedestrian pathways, bike trails, stuff, so there's an activity aspect to it too, that doesn't block the developer from doing, or that community from doing whatever it wants. I don't know if that's something to look at.
what Adams actually requires the developer to do, I don't know why they started to do this, but it actually required that not only do I call it a buffer yard, it also has to be a conservation easement on top of the buffer yard. So you end up doing both. In Adams, they just require that to be a conservation easement as well as a buffer yard.
What does the conservation easement do? What is it?
It really,
I think it gets, well, there's tax assessment fees to that.
yeah, I don't know what the advantage, there's advantages to the township for that. I don't know what they are, and I don't totally understand it from.
Do we have a green space on something? We mandate a certain percent that has to be,
We will, especially when we do the PRD,
Yeah.
that'll be coming into play.
is that the same as conservation?
No. No.
Okay.
We actually require it now, a certain amount of green space. But the PRD can require a lot more.
So the way Adams is written, for example, on buffer yard E, if you take their plant unit multiplier number 1, so the 60 foot, let's see, we've got 60 foot,
What page is that on?
page 6, right, understand this. Buffer yard E says it's a 30 or 40 foot width, but the one multiplier says 60 foot.
And that's what I mean, that it just doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, but in any event, whatever it is, they actually reduce it to 75% of the plantings and only 30 feet, half the distance, if you use an F5 AC fence, which is a brick or stone wall. So if you do a really heavy duty wall in between, you're incentivized and you plant less and have a narrower buffer. But they don't allow the same thing with more, even if it's a 6-foot picket fence, at F3 or F4.
Yeah, you might want to allow an incentive for that as well. If you want fences, I think.
I agree. And I think I think we have too many choices here. I think we should cut it down some. But if we do think we want to incentivize fences, I think that comes with a reduction of the width and a reduction of plants. To make the developers incentivized to do that.
Is there less maintenance for the wall?
What's that?
Is there less maintenance for the fence or the wall? Do you think it's more permanent?
I would have the plants over a wall and
Okay.
for maintenance, that is.
Yeah, because this, the onus of the Adam's responsibility is if 15% of the plantings are destroyed, they have to go in, the owner has to change them, so that's their definition of ill repair.
Yeah,
It's hard to define like, a wall is fragile, if you're going out and inspecting a bunch of walls,
like climb over and sit. I could never climb over the wall.
plants are easy to see, they're dead,
Well, I think the wall, you can tell if it's been painted, you can tell if it's fallen down, pretty easily. I mean, as far as doing like inspections of safety of the wall, I don't know if we could do that.
Probably consent, that's the good.
Walls and fences are really two different things too.
Yeah, they are.
Absolutely. Because a fence is basically, you drill a hole and put a post in, you do something between posts. A wall has a footer in it the whole way. And if you're gonna put that in, it's a lot more money, and it goes in a lot less places. You're not gonna put that in some existing vegetative area along the edge of the development where you have a cut slope, and you're gonna take the top of your cut slope and go and trench the thing to put a footer in. Because you won't have any existing vegetation left.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of a panel wall, that's really a fence, it's a post.
Correct. If it's,
Technically, it's a fence.
yeah, if there's fence and wall, two really different things. I think we should allow either, and they should be incentivized.
Same incentive, benefits. Just a question.
I think it depends on the type of fence. Like, you can see through it, it's not providing any buffer.
So then you're getting into Adams. That's definitions, F1, 2, 3, 4.
I'm just looking at, I mean, there's not much of a buffer, benefit if you're just putting a split rail. It's not shielding anything.
What's that fence definition? There it is.
F1,
Correct. Oh, yeah, F1B, is split rail fence.
says small lettering.
That's a landscape declaration,
Right.
that's not privacy.
It would have to be some kind of privacy fence to take the place of the buffering for the benefits of the.
I think the word incentive,
incentive.
not the best word either.
Just to bring up another random topic and concern. It's only partially applicable to this. One of the things that I run up against when we're putting in things like walking trails along the perimeter, we do some natural trails through our developments. Safety concerns. And if you have solid fences, your safety concerns actually, people are more concerned.
Right.
The more you can see, the easier it is to put a trail along it. The wall there, it becomes more concerning. Just something to keep in mind. I actually had to relocate trails in a couple of places because people were concerned there was no way we were walking there after dark. And I get it. And if you start putting walls and fences around some of this stuff, and then you're putting a walking trail up near it, maybe that concern is gonna start popping up again.
That lighting,
Oh, yeah.
Another pollution.
So, I've had that concern come up on walking trails, and I know that fences are gonna exacerbate that some. Walls more than fences.
The boogeyman.
But I mean, I guess that's a point of discussion as well, right? So they use this, I guess on page 8, paragraph I. Buffer yard may be used for passive recreation, maintaining pedestrian or bike trails, provided that, I mean, is that
Yeah.
something that we would want buffer yard used to be?
I noticed one thing that when we were
trying to say we throw it out for that, I'm just saying,
Right.
let's keep that in mind as we're talking about some of this stuff.
How about, I mean, nobody on the planning commission.
Does the other one talk about evergreen versus deciduous?
It does.
Because you know, winter is a long season here.
Yeah, it does. Yes, there it is. Buffer yard E, that's the page I'm on. But I think buffer yard C. It's interesting, buffer yard C does not require any evergreens. Or maybe, I shouldn't say that. It just doesn't have a number next
You
to
know,
it.
it doesn't require,
What's that?
it
Doesn't require?
no.
No reserve has like a percentage mix, you know, depending on what question, and I'm a big fan of, if the buffer's gonna work, it's gotta work all year long.
I would agree. I think there should be a mix.
I don't know what it calls.
Now, I think when you get down to the buffer yard A, so they're very minimal, I don't know, we need to require it. But if you get into that buffer yard C of Adams, yeah, I think a reasonable mix makes sense.
So what if there's use of that?
Is this looking to see, with the new,
It sounds like
little subdivisions. That's what it's right there. So that's the kind of trade-off, those are the only two, proceeds, but Hamlet, I haven't seen that. Oh, it's on little subdivisions, you don't need evergreen car. One, I really figured there was, oh, wait a minute, I saw the one this guy.
There's gotta be more.
They have a whole bunch down here too. I don't know why they would have to offer that. That's what you want.
It turns out, I'm good friends with a solicitor in the city, so I won't get her right now.
Oh, okay.
Very fortunate.
Maybe it should talk to the reserve about, because it looks like it's terminated, it's not a perpetuity, it's just for a year. You know, the buffer zone is established, that's your responsibility, and you're done. There's no perpetuity to it, it doesn't appear to me.
Where do you see that?
I'm reading that somewhere. That the planning said to be good and valid for a year, and then, but I didn't see any follow-on to that. I'd be curious how they maintain that buffer beyond the development period.
You talking about reserve? Yes. Yeah, it says zoning officer is responsible for that issue.
Yeah. But I meant the term of the enforcement.
I think it's indefinite, I think it's soon, great.
That's what I was reading somewhere here that said that the plannings are, you're kind of warranting them for a year. And then that's,
Then the homeowner, that is the homeowner.
yeah, and then, so I'd be interested to see about the responsibility spectrum for how long, you know, this buffer ordinance applies to.
So I have a question, so John, so whenever a homeowner is responsible for this, how do you, is that written on their deed? How do they know? Because that could be an issue as well. You know, you have somebody buys into a subdivision saying they buy this house, but then they sell it 10 years from now. How is that second owner going to know? that
That's
there's-
been written in their deed.
That's where it's gonna be.
Actually, where it's written is it's on the recorded plan of the subdivision.
Right.
That is
That's-
identified as a buffer yard type on the recorded plan. So when they buy it, that's what's being referenced, is that recorded plan. Now,
That's so you're gonna be able to see that more
the
clearly.
deed's gonna point to that, yes, the deed's gonna point to that. The real problem is, no one ever tells them that, they're not.
That's what they make it.
So, you sell the property,
Uh-huh.
and the township's gonna simply say, hey, it's a recorded document, it's your responsibility to know, and they're gonna say, nobody told me.
You can get that.
And you get that all the time.
How's that any different than right away?
We get that now.
What?
How's that any different than recorded right away?
They show up on a,
Yeah.
property survey that you have to. And you're saying this would show up on the deed then?
Why don't
No, not a deed, it's gonna, the deed's gonna be a reference to the declaration and to the recorded plan, it's gonna reference whatever.
The
And it's
reserve is
on the
saying
recorded plan.
that they can revoke, a certificate of occupancy if they don't maintain the property.
Sure,
So I would hope that would be pointed out to somebody when they.
Sure, but no one when they sell their property is going to the new buyer and saying, hey, by the way, read these ordinances of township, because some of them may apply to you.
So when we moved into Seven Fields years ago, we were required to review the documents and sign that we understood all of the laws and requirements.
But what the
Really,
documents
it's
do you
actually
require?
this,
No, I know, but I'm just saying, I mean, they were like, here you go, you need to know. This is what
Yeah,
you-
It's like what you're signing off on, what you signed off on was the declaration. That's the documents, not the township ordinances.
Right.
You were
Well, no,
given
they-
a resale packet. You were given a resale packet, which would have included declaration, budget, amendments to the declaration, all that stuff.
Correct.
You're required as a seller to provide the buyer by law.
Right.
But
Yeah,
what
I
I
guess
think
you
you're
just
signing
asked
off
the
on,
borough.
not the fact.
No, the borough required us to actually.
That's different.
Well, I purchased a property in Cranberry and had the same exact thing, and it was part of the purchase agreement. It literally said, you're responsible for this buffer. There was a walkway that went between our property and the adjoining property. It was on the agreement, when we bought the property, that you were responsible for maintaining this, mowing it, cleaning snow, insuring it. I mean, it was a big, long deal. I didn't have to read any ordinances. Now, if I want to see that I'm gonna be, my occupancy is gonna be, certificate of occupancy is gonna be revoked, I mean, I'll be answering that.
We don't do.
It was very clear about that, we were responsible for the
We
property.
don't do a certificate of occupancy if somebody sells the property and something moves.
Right, but I'm just saying, I think what Bob's trying to say is that nobody gives a read the ordinances, but I clearly I was responsible, and it was like, there was a fence, split rail fence, I had to replace the rails every 5 years, I mean, it was very detailed, it was in the crossings of Cranberry.
But did that come from declaration?
No, there wasn't even an HOA at the time.
The one we signed was right from the borough.
Yeah. Now, it may have been from the borough, I don't know, but it was at the closing.
I can tell you we don't have it.
I have never seen it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, I haven't seen it.
We don't have it.
And I remember thinking, what are we getting ourselves into?
In 20+ years, I've never.
Well, there's two you heard it just now. So, I mean, it definitely happened.
Yeah.
Again, and somebody from the township would have to know every time a house sold,
But it also happened to
give
know,
them,
Yeah, and how's that done?
and who,
the only,
who from the town?
nobody notifies us when they sell.
I know, and they're not required to notify you. So how could you possibly get something that then you're requiring a new owner to sign?
Maybe the new no lien letter,
Mm-hmm.
because when you're closing on a property,
Yes,
In the township, you know names?
township.
yeah,
You do know names?
I don't.
There's disclosure documents too, when you sell your property, you have to disclose all
Sure, yeah, but that's the
the.
buyer's.
And the desires,
I just used the no lien letter.
Yeah.
I just know that even as a public utility, half the people don't know what price it is moving. And we were supposed to issue no liens.
Yeah.
Oh, I can tell you that not everybody gets them. I think you
Digital,
have to look back and forth.
digital files of these,
We currently do of the Adams one.
is that, I always put my ordinances and stuff into a AI application, and it tells me if I have to do something. It keeps it easier for me, and we could probably have it read 3 or 4 of these and tell us, or you. But, I just can't see in the reserve how long the maintenance, it talks about, it's the property owner's responsibility, I can't see when it ends.
The tree never ends. It wouldn't end.
It shouldn't have.
No, it should have been. You know, why it ends, otherwise it would end.
So it was just indiscreet, doesn't specify.
Tony, is this a PDF you downloaded?
You could probably.
Was it a PDF?
so you downloaded this. He wants to throw the ChatGPT or Grok or something.
If it's a link, you could probably
I
download.
figured.
Yeah.
That's just kind of,
Oh, no, it's great.
oh, it's cool.
We gotta talk.
So Matt, you had said something about farms. We must have talked about farms.
Yeah, I think that's different. Well, they put in the,
They have it as part of the buffer yards as well, that you can do berms
yeah.
or fences.
I don't like adding a lot of soil, I mean, that's just my personal aesthetic thing, and being a civil engineer, berms, to me, you're changing the landscape, you're changing the soil landscape, which is, to me, not the prettiest thing. I mean, you need berms for certain areas, for sure.
Got to have the right site to do it. Really, you end up blocking drainage, or it's on slope, but it really is ineffective, right? Because you're sloping right over it, so it has to be the right type of
I
landscape.
think there's an aesthetic, I can't define it for you, but it's and then you're changing stormwater regimes, you're doing like when you build a basin, or you build up, you're changing all the stormwater flow paths, and you do some environmental harm with it.
I can understand. I know we use them a fair amount, called them mobiles,
Yeah, it's pretty common, yeah.
to go and, buffer like up against the more high traffic roads, between the road and development, we use those landscape mobiles, as we call them, but we always factor storm into it. Now,
Yeah.
you're right, I don't know how you write all that. It's not just as simple as we leave slots through ours to go and handle stormwater, and we put appropriate basins in if we don't have it. But that's a lot to write. And we tend to only use them on relatively flat surfaces. We don't use them on pressure fills. Obviously, they're not gonna work well on pressure fills. But we'll use them as a buffer feature between two flat properties. Between us and the neighbor.
What if you had a lot of fill to get rid of, and if you did grading, you end up with a surplus of fill, and you decide we'll use this to build some landscape berms.
Well, that's what we end up doing. We'll end up, oftentimes, it's all topsoil. We'll build 6 foot of topsoil berm along something as a landscape shield. But it's almost always flat to flat. It's never change of elevation in between the two. So it doesn't work lots of places. It's very limited in our terrain. But I definitely understand your concerns of
The visual, it's a whole aesthetic thing. I've seen developers, just take all their extra fill and build these huge mountains and say, I got a buffer, and it looks like Mount Vesuvius or something.
yeah.
It just doesn't look right. It's man-made, it's a man-made structure.
And Tom pointed out last time as well, one of the problems is plantings on top of those don't always live because they tend to drain the moisture out of it much quicker than the surrounding dirt.
They erode and they just have a lot of maintenance type things. I mean, you can make it look beautiful, especially along the road where you want to isolate the noise and stuff like that.
So, do we want to allow berms, and if so, how?
I don't know how Adams treats it.
They treat it like a fence.
Okay.
They've got B1, B2.
Well, my exception, well, my exception with the contractor, the developer comes in and says, we want to put in a berm because it's A, B, C instead of, buffer zone C. And we decide if we're going to follow it or not.
You can do that, it'll be considered, by the planning commission.
If they make a good case as to why they need it and how it's gonna look, I think we'd be okay with that, but if it's for their convenience, but it's really not achieving the goal, why would we require it, we can say that.
I know the reserve one gives that escape plan where no matter what we say here, you can present something to the planning commission and have them consider it, if it's equivalent. But I'd like a more defined ordinances. But they kind of
meeting the 30-foot planting density of the buffer, or of the buffer yard, and chooses to intentionally put a berm in addition to that, not in place of, or is any kind of reduction in anything, just, I just want a berm there as well as plantings. Could we say no? He's meeting his buffer yard requirements, and we don't have any grading ordinance that would prevent him from reshaping the site how he sees fit. So,
I don't think we could, if he's putting it in the buffer zone, he's met all the requirements.
he's met the requirements of the buffer zone, and he's just added in addition to that, some additional,
I don't think you can smooth out berms.
We don't have a grading requirement in the buffer zone, right, so they can pretty much do whatever they want.
yeah.
And that would be okay, and as you were asking the question, like, I don't know why we wouldn't rule that out.
Agreed. I don't think we want to roll it out, but I don't think we want to incentivize it.
That's correct.
So I don't think we want to treat it as a fence that we're incentivizing, use a buffer here and you can squeeze this or do something different. I don't think we want to do that. But I think that if someone wants to do it, that's fine. Okay. I'm good with that for berms, and if you guys like that.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, so do we want to start taking a look at some of the reserve language here and saying like paragraphs such and such, or do we want to have more time to digest this before we talk about it?
I think it's very long, you probably put it through. Stick to the reserve, I don't know what happens.
Well, Adams, I think what we're going to do is just pick the pieces out of here and plop them into this kind of form. So if we went through the reserve form and said approximately what we like about the way it's written. The opening paragraphs, A and B and under general, they're just fluff.
It doesn't define how they get started, you know, it doesn't, there's no mandate there to put a buffer, like, there's no definition of what.
Well, it
It's like when
says,
the committee determines if you need a buffer, we're gonna tell you you need a buffer, and then you gotta apply those rules.
well, no, it says where it determines a buffer is necessary. I think they do determine that. When they say down here, buffer is required, they have determined where it's necessary, right here. And they've determined the kind of buffer that's required.
Yeah, so this is just general.
I think it's just general language to start, let's see what else to say.
Yeah, I would have said as per table 6-A, and then explain buffer plans are necessary to protect the zone. Buffer plans shall be put in as per 6-A.
In case there are ever challenges.
Opposed to use.
Yeah, I think,
According to the general welfare.
That's about as generic as you can get.
Yeah,
It is.
General welfare.
I wouldn't mind taking that opening paragraph A There it is.
What are our setbacks? Can we correlate the setbacks?
Oh, if you're going multifamily residential, multifamily residential to multifamily residential, you can have a 5-foot buffer. So if you're going 2 quad communities next to each other, between them you can do 2 5-foot buffers. Yeah.
So that's the only way you can go down to 5 feet.
What's that?
That's the only way you get down to 5 feet.
Right.
That's the only, and there is no use of B.
The interesting thing is, if you build something, you build your development, you don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's,
You know, and so the next guy shows up and says, oh, I'm gonna have to put his 5 feet because of that. But the other guy, because he didn't know,
Is that, we said 25?
he's a budding, probably something on the land at that point in time.
Those
Large
first
lot,
rural in the township.
I don't know, how pretty is this?
I think it's a little different for
You know, what's gonna
industrial.
Unless you're talking with a young developer, put them
Well,
at the
if
same
you're
time, and you know.
required 80-foot buffer, setbacks only 25
Very
feet.
often.
Right.
Right.
You could reduce some of this. You have big.
We know what the
We're
zoning,
thinking
but,
buffer between
so you have to go make it.
and with it. Could be bigger, but.
this does beg the question of how we define rows and columns on the table. Because if it's basically just based on the zoning district, or is it based on the use in the zoning district?
Just keep in mind, the mixed use district, you will have homes and you'll have.
I know.
commercial. So I think you have to base it on the uses.
But to Dave's point, you don't know what the use is next to you, so do you have to do worst case use? Say you're developing a property mixed use, and right next to you is also mixed use, both of them are just farms. You put in a residential development, you don't know what's on the site, it could be commercial, it could be something else. So is your buffer gonna then be required to be, what's the worst case use they could do in the mixed use zone? It certainly can't be the best case.
Put a lot in the mixed use, but isn't the use in based on what you're putting in
In what you're touching.
and what you're touching? So if you are putting in a home and the person beside you already, if it's an industrial or not industrial, but if it's
All refrigerated.
public refrigerator, yeah. Good example. So public refrigerator means had to do certain setbacks, regardless of what was next to them, because they're commercial. So when you wanna do it, the commercial has to do X. But if you're putting in a residence, you have to do Y. Regardless of what's next to you, because residential should,
So in a mixed use, you don't have like a C1, C2, you don't have like a depth
No.
area.
mixed.
It's something we're gonna talk about as we get to zoning ordinance. We're gonna talk about our current R1, R2, if we add an R3, and talk about if C should change to C1 and C2.
Yeah, because actually, it's just mixed use is the whole way along there, thinking. North to south to north, whichever way you wanna go, the whole way, 1,500 feet back on each side.
So, let's go back to my example. You've got 2 farms
Mm-hmm.
sitting on Route 19, both in mixed use. I come along and I wanna build a quiet community on Farm A,
Mm-hmm.
touching Farm B. What are the rows and columns in here? Is it multifamily to rural residential? Is it multifamily to this could be commercial?
Potential.
Is it commercial?
It's the use.
But you don't know the use,
So,
so.
I think you have to define that it's multi-residential and a mixed use, this is your buffer. Irregardless of if it's a refrigerator needs or a house, you're gonna say we want a 50-foot buffer in that zone. If it's multi-residential in an R1 district, you can have a lesser buffer because it's gonna be an R1 use next to it. It's not gonna be a potential something else.
Table needs to get 3-dimensional.
It's a longer take.
They have to.
But is that necessary, or is it being protected when that commercial use comes in? Because that commercial use is gonna have a buffer on his side. So say, for example, you've got this multi-family, and you only require 10 foot on him because he's touching a farm right now. But then later, Walmart comes in right next to him, and you require a much bigger buffer. You have the bigger buffer, you still have the 10 foot, plus you've got his 50 foot.
I think it's for existing.
I would agree, I think that's the only way we can do it.
You
You
can't-
can't, it's
you can't
what's next
restrict
to you at that time. And if someone different comes in later, then they're gonna have to meet the standard of what you are.
That's the way I lean, is lean
I think
towards
it has
what's
to be.
existing.
That's-
That makes the most sense.
You can't predict it, and you don't wanna penalize people for putting
That's
something that isn't necessary.
Right.
So it's whatever is next to you at the time. And if we need a special provision for mixed use, I'd be willing to talk about it, but I think it's just simple to say what's in the next to you is what you have to plan for.
And I think it's the same thing, because right now, the mixed use area is 80% homes. Not that that won't change, I mean, it has changed. A lot since the election. But yeah, it's still 80%, it should probably be 90% maybe, but,
Let me get back to your point though. Can the buffer yard be inside the setback area?
Yes,
Okay.
they can overlap.
Okay, they can overlap.
But it would be not,
You almost want to.
yeah.
but knowing what your setback is, especially a side yard, if you're putting in a buffer, you're not gonna put an 80-foot buffer for a 25-foot setback.
Well, you could,
How would that work?
you're essentially, you couldn't build in the buffer either, so your setback effectively becomes 80. But that happens all the time. You can have a 25-foot rear yard setback, but then since you're abutting another property and you're requiring a 30-foot buffer, your effective setback is 30. So even it would exceed what the ordinance allows as setback, it's just, that's the facts of life.
And the PRD actually did that, you had a certain setback, but then you had the entire PRD, had to have an extra, I think it was 20 or 30 foot away around that setback. So it actually added, like a buffer. Okay.
But we run into that a lot of times right on main roads, that you might have a certain setback, but effectively in the main road, your setback's further than that because of the buffer yards and everything that are required.
Well, if you have a setback for PennDOT, you can't put planning stuff in that setback.
Oh, no, you're right, this is all outside of those.
Yeah, that's the.
It's all out of the road right away. All this starts at the edge of the road right away in.
Okay, my question was, does the same apply to someone's property that has a setback, you know? Is it kind of like the right away for a highway? You can't do anything in that.
No, none of that counts. Yeah, none of that counts. I do like the idea of the zone table is based on what the existing property is next to you when you go in. I think it's going
It's the
fairly.
date of approval. It's the date of approval, and after that, you
Oh,
can't
that's
change it.
Prior to the date of submission.
Yes, after you date submission.
Date of submission, okay.
Because otherwise you could really mess somebody up if the paper comes in.
Yeah.
Has to be.
You would get, is that all there?
Because it can take months to get through this and lo and behold, the development's gonna be next to you and it changes the rules of the game after you've done tons of engineering on it.
Okay, I didn't have the right term, submission's fine.
Yeah, but you definitely.
Okay, so back to this. At some point, we have to open to talk about what the table looks like, the buffer table. As to what the buffers are gonna be and what the distances of each buffer is gonna be, the contents of each one.
That rules everything, so.
It does, but I think in terms of, like, what's written here on reserve, that 430-72, that's the kind of thing. It's just gonna change with our wording, some, what they call the rank, would be what our zones are, basically.
Instead of saying which shall be a minimum of 10 feet or a maximum of
those numbers will end up changing based on what our buffers will be.
Okay.
So it could be that we were 10 to 50, it could be worse, whatever, 5 to 100, I don't know. But we'll put the real numbers in, but I think the general flavor of that text is just fine. The buffer types, they've got A through E. I think we'll come back to that, because again, that's gonna be, I think we have to work the table. And I would actually propose next meeting, we should seriously do that. We
Yeah,
should
we
work
have
it
that.
out, spend the time on the table, figure out what exactly our buffer yards are gonna be, the definition of each one, how wide it's gonna be, how dense the plantings are, and how they're applicable zone to zone, for use to use. Do all of that at a meeting. That's gonna be the core of it.
It is.
.430-74. I don't understand why it's even necessary. That should be defined by a table,
Yeah.
right? Isn't that just rows and columns in the table, so that should disappear?
I think they're just trying to make that case example a worse level, you know, they're trying to say, hey, if this happens, we have to have a minimum of 20 foot, they're putting it into a higher class, because if they see it as a danger.
Oh, I don't disagree, but I think that the
I
table
don't
takes
think
care of it.
table takes care of
Yeah,
it.
the table takes care of it, falls out of the table.
I think the same can be
Same
said
as for
for
75, yeah, 75 is,
I bet you it was added after.
the road. Road should separate, what the heck is that? I'm on D, 75D.
Yeah.
A road separates two districts, planted buffer shall be provided within a district of higher intensity. So you got to think about.
Right. Are you taking care of that again on the, I mean, on the table? I mean, isn't that on the table as well? I mean, it doesn't matter if the road separates you, you're still abutting that property, right?
Right.
Or is that, because there's a road separating you, is that considered abutting that?
I don't actually know what this means, the word implies.
Yeah, I'm kind of confused.
Is it a road at the edge of your property, you own this property, then it would be handled by the table.
Sounds like if a road goes through a light industrial or industrial or industrial.
I'm actually just even wondering, up on Stone Church, I own property on both sides of the road.
I was gonna say.
So, my development crosses Stone Church.
Yeah, but that's not a different district. Right?
It's not a different district, but
But in Whitestown, you could have R1, you could have conservation. R1's on this side, conservation's on this side.
And so it's gonna go on the
That-
highest intensity.
That may not be as bad, but, you know, you could have industrial, East Lancaster, you have industrial on one side and residential on the other.
Yeah, I think that's.
So I think where you have that as the case, that you need a buffer, road can't be your buffer, you need a buffer, put it
On the highest
on
intensity,
the higher.
which would be the industrial side, not the
but
residential.
that's assuming you have a contiguous piece of property that crosses over.
I don't think that's the contiguous, it's two districts. It's not, I don't care if it's contiguous or not.
But you as a developer only own A or B then.
But, right, but
So
it's
if you own
saying,
A or B,
so say
you should only require your side.
Yeah.
no, the higher intensity.
I don't own that side.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, so if it happens after the fact, you're saying, right? So right now, like you just example you gave, if there's industrial on, Lancaster, and on the other side of the street, there's houses. If the industrial came in after the houses, the industrial has to put up the buffer.
Sure, but that's no different than what we talked about with our table of uses. I think that's
Right.
exactly the same.
Exactly.
It's exactly the same as what our table of uses already says.
Right.
I'm just trying to think of,
Does
does
that
this mean something more than that?
well, it does the road consider adjoining property, consider an adjoining property?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, as long as that's the case,
I guess this is just making it clear that it's not, you know.
A road shouldn't impact that at all.
I think the other thing you need to say is the road doesn't reduce or eliminate buffer.
Yeah,
Okay.
I yeah, to say something like
That,
that.
that could be a reasonable statement to put in, yeah.
Be a note to the chart.
Right.
Yeah, that's probably what
I
we're
think I
trying to
did
do.
the chart that way.
Yeah. This is probably in zoning, but what are we gonna do when a property is in multiple zones?
Well, when we're hopefully done with our zoning, we won't have that. The zoning will go on the property.
Not gonna happen, because what happens is, just like what I do, I'll buy 3 or 4 properties that all adjoin. Some of them, like up in Meridian, I bought commercial and I bought residential. I needed a commercial so I could get to my residential, so I bought 3 properties to get there. Now all of a sudden I do a consolidation plan and consolidate them all to one. There lies the problem.
Did you change the zoning on this, or did you?
You could change the zoning.
Good.
But right now we're doing 1,500 feet back in the mixed use, and we change that, make it property.
Potentially, that would be preferred.
But that's gonna happen, is that even if our zoning map right now makes sure we draw the line around all the properties, someone will consolidate something so they can do a development, and now you've got mixed use and R1, both on a consolidated piece of property.
Well,
So something we have to address.
when you do the consolidation,
But here's an issue though. So on the conservation, if you have a farm backing up against the conservation, you don't wanna make that whole farm conservation. You don't wanna make 100 acres conservation, because
Oh, no, I
it's
think
streams.
that you define it, and then when they do a consolidation, at that point, you make them go through a zoning change to make it
that's
something.
just what I was thinking,
Yeah,
yeah.
whatever it is, it's something that it's one zone parcel that they have to go through that step on, whenever they consolidate.
In our case, what we ended up doing is I consolidated 3 parcels, subdivided back into 2, a commercial and a residential, but the commercial line changed from where it was.
And I can see
So
that.
you did change the zoning, basically.
We did, because it used to follow goofy property lines and we squared things off and something like that, but
I would think you'd make that a requirement.
Yeah.
okay.
Well, do you remember that?
I know all the rules. That's the nice part
Well, that's
about
good,
it.
because then you can tell us what they are.
Exactly, and we need to, I'm not here to be against development, but I can tell you what developers try to do, and we need to work to make sure that it works for everybody. You're not
I would
just
make you put a
using.
buffer in between each of all those properties.
What's that?
I would make you put a buffer in between all these properties, because that's the way the ordinance is. Even if you're running a road through the mountain.
Okay, buffer yard maintenance.
Let's see, giving them 30 days, makes sense.
Right. I do think you have to include the growing season.
I don't have an objection to what's written here. Anyone else?
That's good.
The last sentence is
Well, that's not it.
Have you ever revoked,
Yeah, to do.
have you ever revoked
No.
occupancy?
Not for this.
We don't even, the township doesn't even, give out occupancy to MDMA.
I wouldn't put that sentence in.
No.
But as far as enforcement and leverage to require them to do something, we talked about that earlier, and I don't think we came up with any.
No, John's gonna check with,
He's
Yeah.
gonna look into that.
yeah.
I still like just telling them to walk snow
I
Your
love
roads in
that.
winter.
Just to be aesthetic, I think it would be great. And everybody in the neighborhood knows you're not following the rules. You didn't get plowed, it's all your fault.
I'm being facetious.
It's a
but-
remote occupancy, that's really what I think.
Thought it'd be funny, so.
What do you
I don't think I would see it. Go around the house,
If they don't maintain the buffer yards, we don't snow plow the roads.
I mean, ultimately,
Until they fix the
On
buffer.
mine, it's on mine.
Yeah, of course. It's not, you can't just find something, you have to.
But you're looking for compliance, not.
Right, we don't want to work case, right, we just want people to do this work.
What are the penalties?
Well, it probably needs to be fine.
500 to 1,000.
Oh, is it in there?
Where are we at?
It's-
Oh, fine.
It references penalties.
Oh, if we're gonna reference a number, that number should not be in here.
Correct.
Because you're gonna put them all in some other annually approved. Yeah.
Planning plan.
If you do,
I think, what's that?
you do take elevation into account.
How?
No, I mean, you can't expect somebody if they're, if, you know, the adjoining property is in up the hillside, and you have to look at that to decide what needs to be planned on that. I think that, it's a little bit harder to say you have to do these three kind of trees or shrubs that won't grow on that hillside.
I would hope that whatever list of plants we would pick would work when cut, or fill slopes, or level.
Right.
And that a developer should be able to find a material that works.
Yeah.
But I don't think we wanna change requirements
No.
based on
you're right.
elevation, and all of a sudden, it's like, and that's not enough, so that's too much of that.
I see what you mean, yeah.
You're getting into all that kind of arguing again.
Yeah.
And I don't think you wanna take into account that, oh, I'm sitting down here, and my neighbor's sitting up top here, and I have to plant something that's gonna shield so he doesn't see me.
Yeah, you
Well,
can't do that.
You know, if you live on the top of the hill, you're gonna see the valley, no matter what you do, it's just the way it is.
All the good.
Yeah.
It would require screening. I wonder if we wanna have something on a requirement for rooftop stuff. But I'll just give you the scenario. I lived in Cranberry, Route 228 was all cornfields, and they put a development in behind what is now Lowe's and Target and all that. Those people lived up there, and they were looking down on, you know, nice cornfields and a Good Samaritan campground or something. The Lowe's and Target moved in, but the back of their buildings towards the plant probably met the buffer requirements,
Sure.
which didn't even go as high as the buildings. And those people up on that hill also were looking at air conditioners and roofs and it's horrific. And so, you can't fix that, but you know, as far as we're talking about buffers and things, if we put something that in that event, if it's the back of the store or even the front, that they have things on the roof, they have to have some kind of screening on them, so at least it looks more like a building and not air conditioning units and.
And lighting too, the lighting.
I don't know how you do that, but yeah, I mean, I just don't know how you do it.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you screen that?
They put a, well, yeah, I don't know, even, if it's high, if they're high enough, even if you put something in front of the air conditioning unit, you're still gonna
Doesn't matter,
look
yeah.
down and see.
Sometimes it's architectural standards, so the buildings have to look. In Cranberry, Walmart had to change the color of their building.
Yeah, but not on the top.
No.
Yeah, that's a tough issue, because if you do
I've been
any of
involved
these things in the valley,
in
below something, it's always gonna screen it, no matter what you do.
Well, what about the opposite side of it? Like what they did on SolidWorks, where they built up on that third phase of City Bridge. They took and built that up so high, it's well above where it ever was before. And now all we get is people standing up there yelling down and everything else. With no buffer where it used to be, you know, monster trees.
That's the burn. Yeah. Sightlines, that's what you're talking
Yeah, I
about.
don't know how you would.
There's an aesthetic aspect of that, but it's hard to define.
Sure.
They just recommend a whole bunch of plantings, you know, they have these tables, you know. So they leave a lot to the developer to define what that buffer is.
Some things we may not be able to fix.
Yeah,
I mean, to our advantage, I don't know what we'll get, or anything that big.
know,
at some point.
you know, commercial investment type building, a manufacturing plant, something like that. We'll do all the screens, the people perched up on the hill isn't gonna help them.
It's
And they never can, no matter what you
I
do.
don't think
It's
that's-
just-
I don't think we can fix it, I don't think so. We still require buffers, it just isn't gonna, you know.
I know Cranberry's still limited by the lighting, you know, if that's the only thing they could regulate.
That's huge too.
It is huge.
That's gonna be getting harder with all the new LED lights everybody's insisting on putting in too.
And 430-71 does say it though, as long as you can define offensive views.
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
literally says you have a screen, so technically you can make a case that, well, you can't build that there because you can't screen the offensive view.
Defending what offensive view is.
That's the problem, you're never gonna be able to define that, and
No,
you go to
it's
court
a-
on that one, who knows?
What did you say, John?
I'll know it when I see it.
That's a good definition.
Yep.
That's what the
Well,
learning
Pittsburgh has
justice
so
is.
much, you know, elevation shifts, that's why I think they put in this total visual screening.
Yeah, I agree. I think
They wanted to block all sightline stuff, so, because of the, you know,
And then people complaining because they can't see the green on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
The
Or on the
other
trail,
side, or,
and I can't.
yeah.
Safety concern.
sightlines is hard to work.
It's real hard.
Do we want
So
to take
back
out
to-
where it says, this
what's
classified terms be obliged to consist of an appropriate mix?
Well, I think
To
most
render
of,
instant effect.
where are you at?
B.
B. Towards the end of B.
Well, actually, I was thinking that 477 is essentially what we're replacing with our definitions from Adams. So I think we can just skip that until we have a draft of what we do there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Same with C.
The whole thing, I mean, all of 77, yeah. A through D, all of it, we'll just revisit when we do the merge of the Adams stuff back in here, we'll see if we need to adjust anything. I do think allowing alternates is a good idea in 78. That if a developer wants to come and make a strong case for why he would like to do something different, I have no problem listening to see what they wanna do.
Yeah, I think that,
Gives the planning commission some discretion.
This is, so
This
this is
does
where
say-
the walls and things could come in, if they wanna do a smaller buffer, to put up a solid wall or a solid fence or something like that.
Well, were we gonna add in the possibility of fence to begin with, incentive wise? So if we add in the possibility of a fence, it will already be there, but they can still propose something different. I think all of 79 is very much what we're gonna take from Adams as well and merge in. And I do think with respect to caliper of tree on the small trees, end-of-story stuff, we probably want to use language that's 1.5 inches or 6 height or something, 6 foot height or something like that, because they're not all defined by caliper when you get to that size.
I do like specifying evergreen,
I do. I think evergreen should be part of our mix in several of these buffer types, without a doubt. We'll decide that as we go through the buffer definition next time.
I like 80.
81 would be interesting.
Wait a second, where are we
you
at?
like 80?
Oh, 80, there it is, James.
You gonna say? Oh, see, they take materials, something like it, and,
fix in 60 days.
well, it's funny, it says 60 days, and it says 30 days.
And then they want a landscape architect to sign off on things, so they're now they're getting their expert in there.
Add to the buffer yard, the A on 80A. I typically find that I don't do a buffer the whole way around the property. And one of the reasons for to that is that, take for example the townhouse project, whatever that new project is down there.
Page Place,
What is it?
Page Place,
Page Place, Wrigley.
Yeah, Wrigley's down.
Wrigley, Page Place,
I would argue that we don't even put a buffer yard requirement on the back side of that. That's all wetlands
yeah.
and never gonna be touched. It's all natural, and we're talking hundreds and hundreds of feet of natural sand. Typically, what we put on plans is defining buffer yards where properties come within proximity of the boundary. Areas not to be touched that are left as, in Adam's case, conservation easements or wetlands or something like that. We don't even overlay it with the buffer yard.
Because back there, there's actually, the township is going to have, I think they already did have actually a right of way along where the sewage easement is right now. So, and yeah, there's not gonna be anything back there because it's dedicated now, and it's open space, they can't, they're not, won't be allowed to do anything else with that. Anyway.
That's conservation back there too.
So I
Yeah,
guess
well,
some
then, well,
language.
the extreme of the
I think
township.
that goes back to that preference for natural.
Yeah.
If there's already a buffer, and it's created by some equivalency there,
They make the
then
case,
you don't need that.
yeah, they make the case that we don't wanna put the buffer in here, this is natural.
It's very
We
wet.
don't wanna disturb it, and the planning commission says, yeah, okay, we agree.
And I agree, but what I'm saying is, you don't even label it buffer yard on that. You don't inspect it, it's just
Oh, yeah.
natural, it's just there. It's just, it doesn't show on the plan, because as soon as you put it on the plan, you're potentially responsible for counting dead trees in that section. And it's like, why? Why?
Yeah, because you're gonna have things are gonna die, things are gonna grow, things are,
Yeah.
it's a natural area, so they're gonna have that no matter what, so. Yeah, I don't, nobody wants to.
Wouldn't that fall under alternatives, like Dave said? I mean, I would think leave the buffers there and have the developer say, like an alternative to build wetland, conservation area.
But that's actually not the way a plan is developed. The way a plan is developed is the developer comes to us with a plan showing these things on it. So he would show buffer yards.
Or he would say, I request an alternative beforehand with his plans. Why engineer? I mean, I know we have an alternative as an option. Why would the developer not be going down there and come and put a buffer zone in? You could tell him to do that. You say, no, that alternative is not acceptable, but that would be silly.
I think, what I recommend is, keep the language the same, but in a matter of procedure, when they come in and say, we don't want to affect this wetland down here, we're gonna use this in lieu of our buffer, we can agree, and we tell them, do not label it as a buffer zone on the drawings, because you say that creates that requirement. So,
I'd be fine with something like that.
and we'll just do that, because we did that for the property down at the bottom of the hill, a couple months ago, forget the name. The Hahn property. But we made some recommendations, take that off the drawings, you have to add this in, you should do this. None of that's written down, it was just good policy and practice to do things like that, it helped him, it protected us. I think we can do the same.
I'm fine with that too.
And I think that's part of the planning commission job is to look at plans and recommend, different ways that they might be able to do things. Better ways that work better within the confines of the ordinances.
Because we're never gonna get it so buttoned up tight that it just works, right? There's gonna be leeway in a lot of places. But I'm agreeing with you, we don't wanna label it a natural ground buffer. But if they use other areas, other natural areas, as we approve that as buffer, do we not label that as buffer? We just, then, I think you have to, right? Because at some point, if it's not the buffer, then somebody else comes back in and cuts it all down and makes a parking lot out of it.
Well, in Adams, it's a little different because all those areas were conservation as well.
Okay.
So you have to leave them natural. And in Adams, it was essentially a negotiation with the township of saying, hey, we're gonna run buffers here and here, we're not gonna touch this area, it's back behind our pond, it's all natural, blah, 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 and it's like, okay. And that's essentially the way the discussions go.
It can't be marked on a drawing that way, this is a natural buffer zone, or a natural, however you wanna put it. You know, just so it doesn't ever have to be inspected, it doesn't have to have anything done to it, and, I mean, wouldn't that be better to mark that on a drawing, because like, this room here is gonna have, this is open space, they can't do anything with it. You know, and that's going to be a note on that drawing.
Natural buffer zone or something, which
Yeah, something to that effect, yeah.
still, the requirements are still there.
Right.
Well, I would think you want to make like an alternative, like you suggested, and like Bob's saying, the people don't have to maintain it. I mean, you can build that into the plans, and okay, this is a natural buffer, but you don't have to call the trees that are falling down, I mean, it's unreasonable. But that would be.
If that should happen to go away for whatever reason, let's say all the trees get blighted,
Well,
then they have to come in and put a buffer in.
yes, well, that's the thing.
At some later point in time. So there's still a requirement for a buffer that we just elected to let them use the natural buffer versus the requirement.
And reserve, going back to that general statement we had, that says natural and physical features such as steep walls, wetlands, vegetation, railroads, and roads should be used to separate conflicting areas. So there's already a.
Yep.
And if you got 100 feet of wetlands, don't you have a buffer yard already?
You know, I'm not understood it anyway.
There has to be a riparian, because there's scholars run down there, you have to put a buffer there, and I'm not sure what that is. But in Jackson Township is talking about existing trees. Because everything not smaller than 2-inch diameter, but, yeah, you can use that as a buffer. But on the creek, scholars run, you have to put something there.
The rest of it, you fine. How far do we wanna go here, guys? Typically,
Sounds like Bob's done.
No, I'm fine either way. We typically wrap up in 2 hours, what we typically do, but do we wanna try to plod through the rest of this, or not?
Reserve?
Yeah,
We could probably do something.
people good with that?
I'm okay with it, you know, I'd rather get it done, we've got a lot to do.
We,
Well, I table it to me.
well, not just this, then the next we have to go ahead and, this would finish out the subdivision ordinance. This is
We really
the last
don't
part
have-
of the subdivision ordinance, it'd be nice to get it done.
There's not much more left.
Yeah.
Well, 81 seems
Wow,
a little much.
That's a lot.
Anyone is really like, wow.
I would throw all of 81 away.
Yes. Window openings on the northern exposure should be limited inside the number.
What?
Yes.
D.
I was like, wow.
Roads are supposed to go what, north and
I'm not
south?
sure really how that applies to.
I'm not sure how that.
No, roads are supposed to go east and west on
What's that got to do with buffering?
It's energy conservation.
Oh, so,
And the truth is, with the topography, you work with the topography you have. If you think that you can meet
No.
this and not do cuts and fills everywhere,
they must be thinking Arizona.
I love the northern windows.
yeah.
That's great.
Pretty cold on that side of the window.
Okay, fences.
Yeah, so, something
Is there any ordinances?
Are we pulling fences out of here other than fences related to buffer yards?
Next, we have fences in our,
So I think the fence and walls goes away here completely. All we're gonna be talking about,
oh yeah, because this gives you building lines and everything, we already have that.
yeah, that's separate, that's not related to this stuff. The only fences we're talking about are the ones related to the buffering table and the definition of buffer yards, okay?
Yeah.
Oh, so we already over time, got a
You
general.
go back.
Takes like 83 out too.
Yeah, 83 is.
Well, yeah, of course you can put great fences without permission, you know.
fences, so
84 too.
that all works.
Yeah, 84 is minimum. That's it.
Wow. It's got much faster.
Again, fences.
Yeah, 85 goes away.
Landscaping for good.
Side triangles, that's covered elsewhere.
It is, it's in the south of, so.
So we scrap that. And the suggested planning for parking areas, that's something we still have to, well, the parking areas, we never finished what we're gonna do demand wise and plantings in the medians and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for like a commercial building,
Commercial buildings and all.
commercial parking lot.
But I don't think we can talk about that tonight, but that is something we're gonna have to address. And then the plant list, the table, will be in the next page. I'm good with starting that and go from there. So we did finish that thing. Other than this does not mention anything about enforcement, everything shall be.
Yeah, there's nothing in there.
It shall be
It has to be in there,
but at the top.
if you're going to enforce it.
We can add an exception.
Yeah, you can do that.
That's not a big
You can use the language for that one.
And you're gonna talk to the solicitor
Yeah,
and see if they,
I
instances where they can't.
want to know where they pulled so many documents because they didn't maintain it.
I would love to see that. 'Cause what do you do when you're on the record? You pick five out.
I'm like, and I'm gonna ask her about the northern windows.
Just because you're interested.
Just because I like to tease her.
Yeah.
We have a new website, right? And I didn't know, I noticed some of the things that were referenced aren't there yet. Is that the work in progress?
Very much so.
Yeah, it's been quite.
There's some word issues too, there's some misspelled words.
There's big thing, there's standards.
Okay, any additional comments? Next time-
Chart.
Next time we will do a couple things. We will vote on a new chairman. We will work on the chart, and obviously whatever comes before us.
You have a presentation by the Resiliency Committee as well.
Yep.
So you'll have a shorter meeting to work on these things, so.
Okay, do we have any plans coming? Any plans for you?
You may have a plan coming, for Page Place. If it-
Wait, so you're in the midst of reviewing something then? Or is it,
No, they're in the midst of revising. If it comes.
what's the requirement in terms of the length of time?
30 days,
So then we'll